Welcome to the first recorded lecture on 7E, Learning Cycle Model. And that is what you're going to learn in a span of 15 to 30 minutes in this recorded video. Or you might ask this question, is 7E learning model really a new innovation in terms of the learning models and learning cycles? The answer to that is no, it is not. As you are seeing here, the 7E learning model is actually derived from an existing learning model, which is basically the 5E. You might have heard of this, but 5E is now upgraded to the 7E. And there are reasons, which we will be discussing in this module, why such changes or revision were done to the existing learning model. The very stark contrast that you can see on the two learning models is that in the 7E, there is now the introduction of illicit and also the extend part of the learning cycle model. But the rest of the stages or the rest of the E's are basically still present in both the 5E and the 7E. And we will put emphasis as to the reason why in education we move or that certain innovation in this learning cycle model was actually put forward. So the reason behind it is something that we will see in the span of this lecture. Do we really need to review something? Do we really need to ask some questions to gauge the understanding of our students from their previous, say, physics classes or their chemistry classes? The answer to that is sharply a big yes. We really need to do that. It is because the research in the cognitive sciences have shown that eliciting prior understanding of our student is really a necessary component of the learning process. Because in that way, in the eliciting phase, we are able to see the thinking patterns of the students, their misconceptions, the way they view that certain topic, the way they, meaning that the depth of their understanding of the specific concept that is very essential for us to understand because it helps us direct how will we deliver this lesson, whether we will deliver this lesson on a higher level or whether we will still go to the very basic. That is something that will be afforded to us if we are able to elicit the prior understanding of our students. And that is what we are doing in the eliciting phase of our 7E learning cycle model. Now, in your lesson plan, which I will be putting the detail in the description, you will be seeing that eliciting is the first phase, and it is where you will do, as I've said, review. You would like to understand your students. Unsa man nilang pagsabutan nga topic, nakasabot ba gid sila or naay mga misunderstanding or misconception diri ta mo sulod sa eliciting na portion sa atong lesson. So kinahanglan jud kayo na siya nga maghimo tag elicit. Now, how do we go around doing eliciting phase? So you could simply ask a question to your student like, for example, you would like to ask your student, if I have two masses that I drop together and assuming I neglect the air resistance, will the two masses, even if they have different masses and largely different masses, fall to the ground at the same time? Now, you could throw that question to your student and you could gauge from their responses unsa man ilang pagsabot ato. So kung moingon sila nga magdungan sila sir, or moingon sila nga dili sila magdungan ma'am, so that means that is already your key point that you should think na hala, kung mga estudyante di ay dili pa ingon ani ka solid ilang understanding about this specific concept. So in that way, along the lesson nimo, you could at some point touch that certain concept and try to correct something. Kung na-diagnose nimo nga medyo sayop man nilang pagkasabot aning concept or nakasabot sila pero dili man kayo in depth kayo. So as a teacher, you could then think na siguro in my discussion ako ning targeton gamay murag matouch na ko ni gamay so that I could correct existing misconceptions, which is really a great thing na dapat na to ma-address kay kung dili siya ma-address at an early age or in like say grade 7, grade 8, grade 9, pag abot nila university, that is something that they will bear with them And of course, that will be a hindrance towards understanding more complex topics. It's because they don't understand, or their understanding of the basics are incorrect. So that is why we really need to do eliciting. And that is just one way of doing eliciting. So there are multiple ways, and I leave up to your imagination how will you do the eliciting. But the main point here is about diagnosing the learning of your students, whether they get the concept or not. Gauging whether unsa ka ang percentage ng pagsabot, whether they understand it fully or just partially. So that is the basic gist of doing eliciting. And again, it's up to your creativity. How will you do that eliciting? Whether you will make some, you just throw a question, or you demo something. You could also do that. And yeah, there are really multiple ways of doing eliciting. Now, again, on a more theoretical side, we need to conduct eliciting because the student actually build knowledge, or we know this, that the process of building knowledge is actually an acquisition of existing knowledge, adding to it, or revising some part of it. And that is why it's very hard for us to introduce something or a more advanced concept if they did not understand the most basic concept. So that is why in eliciting, you will get to know your students nga wala sila kasabot ana. That means that is your signal na, okay, wala sila kasabot ani, so dili din ako ni siya matudlo kini nga advanced nga concept. Kinahanglan day kumubalik ani gamay. Because all your struggles in teaching that concept, if they did not, or they were not able to get the most basic concept, will be in vain. It is because of the fact that we know, according to the literature, that the way we build knowledge is from existing knowledge. And if we don't have that existing knowledge, it's very impossible to build more complex knowledge. Now, the salient thing about eliciting is you don't really need to be so conscious such that whenever there are misconceptions, or you notice that medyo alanganin ang pagkasabot sa estudyante, that you correct the student upright. There is no rule that says that you need to do that. But the thing about doing eliciting is to understand them and their level of understanding. And hence, dili gud necessary na moana ka nga sayop inyo ang pagkasabot ana niya. So, since you are able to diagnose, ang atong buhaton na sa teacher is to do some modification with how we will deliver the lesson. So, kung kabalutan nga medyo alanganin ani nga concept, so syempre siguro atong i-tone down atong pag-deliver sa lesson. Or parts of the lesson will be explicitly addressing that concept yun. Okay, ang sa point magud sa elicit is to understand your students, to diagnose them, dili gid ka mag-discuss pa dira. That is why there is really no need to arrive at a consensus or closure at this point in terms of the students' responses. So in the engaged part, this is the second part, the engaged part, this is a component that is present in the 5E and also in the 7E. And basically, this is where you engage your students, you motivate them. It's very difficult for them to get interested in your topic that you are going to discuss if you will not provide with them something that will lead them to ask some questions, something that will lead them to think why some things happen. So that is why we really need to put engagement in our class. So it could be in the form of a game, it could be in the form of a video, anything that you think might pique their interest, you could put it in your engaged part. For example, you could show them a video of a rolling marble on a different tracks, and if you're trying to tell them the concept of the least principle there in physics, so you will be presenting this video as your motivation. You could do that because the student will ask, lang ano man to nga, ano man unta na siya, ano nag-una maghagbong ang isa, ay nag-una reach ang Julin sa tip dito kumpara sa isa. So ingon na nga the same ra man unta sila kuan, the same ra sila og kanang agianan ba. But different lang ang shape sa ilang track. So probably you could show that one. Or also you could show something intriguing about the problem. Say for example, if you're teaching like earth science, and then you're trying to present to them the gravity of the melting Arctic ice, or the tragedy of the melting of the continental ice. So you could show to them a glass of water, one is filled with water and the ice is floating on it, and you let that ice melt, and then you have another glass Although it will really take time, that is why you really need to think of your engaged part kasi dapat gagmay lang mo gud ni sila na portion. So when you try to um, present some interesting thing, you have second glass, still it has some portion of water but the ice are stuck with each other, and you let that melt, and then probably it will melt for like 5 minutes. So probably the video na lang ani nga case, mag-video na lang ka, ikaw nag-video. So pakitaon nimo sila. So syempre ang ma-observe ato nimo, katong nag-stack na ice will melt and then will overflow. So that in that situation, you could raise that question to your students because that is something that is somehow counterintuitive. And you would ask some question nga, why do you think I show this picture to you? So can you cite some physical instances where this is being modeled, or that instance is being modeled by the melting ice then overflowing? Ngano man katong ice nga galutaw, wala man sa nag-overflow after it melt. Why nganong katulang mang ice nga nag-stack pag melt nila maoy nagluta nag-overflow. So those are some things that you could throw as an engage to your student, because if I'm the student and I'm seeing that, I will be intrigued about the lesson instead of just saying that like climate change and global warming blah blah blah. So especially if you're handling very very small kids, so you really have to consider the attention that you are getting their attention. So as much as possible, you really have to make them engage in whatever means possible. So it doesn't also mean that the engage part nimo, like you're trying to be engaging with the students, is dira lang pud sa engage na portion. But from experience, when I was able to handle high school, you really have to be like joking around at the midst of the discussion. You really have to like relate to them by getting something na by saying something that will get their attention, but of course make sure that it is really relevant to your topic of discussion. For the explore and explain phase, the explore phase, this is where you provide the opportunity for the students to gather data, to record observation, to do experiment themselves, to plan experiment, to design experiment, whether you're giving them the data and you're asking them to graph the data and interpret the results out of it, or you ask them of a more deeper question such as developing a hypothesis out of an observation that is being done in the explore phase. Now, take note, in the learning model, you are seeing that explore comes before explain. That means that we allow the students to build concepts themselves before the teacher comes in and tell them bluntly about the concept. So that is very inquiry based in approach. So in the explore phase, basically this is just the action of your students. So as a teacher, you are facilitating the students as they do some of these actions that I've mentioned earlier about experimenting, presenting graphs, developing hypotheses. So the thing that we are going to do in the explore phase is we need to be mindful also. While the students are doing their activity, we need to be mindful of the things that they are saying. It is because through there we could also see na hala sayop daw yung pagsabot ani. So ingon ana dili lang kay nag-explore ang student, so kita nga sa teacher kay galingkod na ta didto. So no, we are facilitating the learning of the student. That is why we really need to listen what went with their discussions, because we could take specific words that they have said and use it in our discussion para makorek na to ila ang mga misconceptions. In the explain phase, this is where you actually are introducing now the models, the laws, the theories diri sa explain nga phase. Because in the explore phase, wala kay gihatag dapat nga definition, wala kay gihatag nga law, wala kay gihatag nga model. You're just basically allowing the student to explore as much as possible. But of course, in the explore phase, you should be thinking about giving structure. That means you're giving some key question, guide questions, some activity materials for them to follow. Dili sa pwede na in the spirit of exploration, kay explore man so you just give a very vague idea to your student and then expect to get some productive result out of it. So you need to be really mindful in the way you craft your instructions as well as your learning materials, na ma-reach yun mo ang imong goal sa imong exploring a phase. But then again, there are no blunt explanations given to the student in the exploring a phase. That is where they are constantly or actively constructing the knowledge. So in the explain phase, then you will be using the result from the explore phase of your students. Say they've conducted an activity, and then you of course in the explain phase you will communicate with them, ask them what they got from the activity, what were their conclusions or what were their hypotheses out of the developed data that or the data that they are gathering. So in the explore phase, you're basically still communicating with them, and this is your opportunity to use whatever data that they have gathered themselves firsthand and use it to present the concept. Say, for example, you're presenting like the very basic thing about falling objects, that it won't matter, the masses of falling object won't matter as long as the air resistance is negligible. So if you're trying to present this concept, I am thinking that in your explore phase, you're allowing your student to drop different objects of different masses and try to record the time of impact or the time it hits the ground. And probably in your explain phase, you will not start with an equation yet. You will ask your student, what did you observe in your experiment? So did the masses of the object from your experiment really matters? So they might have different answers, they might have the same answers, which is good because the point of having an exploration phase is giving an opportunity, the same, giving the students an opportunity to experience the concept firsthand, even if they don't really understand it yet fully. So in the explain phase, again, you could then use the experiences of the students and you could try to fill in the models, the laws, the hypotheses, or the theories that you are trying to tell them and discuss with them. But as much as possible, do not detach your discussion na dili na lang po siya makonect sa ilang experience or sa exploring a phase. So you should be always thinking that in the way you present in the explain phase, you constantly go back to the explore phase sa imong mga students. And the next or the fifth A is elaborate. Now, in the elaborate, this is where you provide an opportunity for your student to apply the knowledge that they firsthand did in the explore phase and you supported in the explain phase. What they are going to do with that knowledge is to try to put that in a new context. So that means if we are trying to stick with our example about masses, falling masses, regardless of the difference in mass, will reach the ground at the same time as long as the air resistance is negligible. An elaboration phase of that could be asking the student if you will drop like a hammer and a feather, or I know that is very classic, so let's try to think of another example. Like you have a twin and the twin is somehow bigger than you and you will fall together, you will jump in a spaceship on the moon which has zero air resistance. What do you think, or who do you think will reach the ground at the same time? So in that case, you are now moving from the context of the earth to the context of the moon. So you're trying to provide an opportunity for the student to think whether how will the new concept that they are learning apply in a new context. So that is why you ask them, asa mahitabo pag abot sa moon? Example, you could be very creative in the way you phrase your exploring na phase. The thing that you should be thinking is this is where the opportunity, or this is where you provide an opportunity for your students. Again, this is for your students to show that they have learned the concept and put it in a new context. The elaborate phase is something that we really know, probably since we are in education, to be the transfer of learning, which is from the study of Thorndike. So this is where we try to understand whether the students are able to transcend beyond the classroom. Kasi according to Hilgard and Bower, the schools are actually created to support the expectation for more general uses of knowledge. Thus, the learning should not be confined in the four walls of the classroom such that we deal so much with theory and it's absent with any application. Mauna na, especially since we are in the field of physics, we really need to present the theory such that the students will see that this is how it works in application, or in real life. So that the concept there in the elaborate is really about the transfer of learning with the view that education and learning goes beyond the four walls of the classroom. Now, in the evaluate phase, this is where we conventionally give quizzes in the form of formative and summative assessments. But what you should note is that you should not think of this learning cycle na the evaluation where you provide an assessment is only done at the end. So you could actually do formative assessment while they are doing the activity, while probably you are explaining, you're doing some formative assessment in the form of questions. Because in formative assessments, you are trying to like straightening up of their understanding of the concept without necessarily giving them scores for how they respond. Kasi ang goal mo sa mong formative assessment is gusto nimo ma-assess unsa ilahang current state of knowledge and try to hilot imo na siyang hiloton taman sa ma-correct na siya kung sayop man galing ilang existing state of understanding on a specific concept. That is why I would really like to emphasize that the evaluate phase doesn't mean na naa na siya dapat sa end. You could actually do evaluation while you are discussing. You could actually do the evaluation in the form of formative assessments in any parts that you see fit in the learning cycle model. And also in the evaluate phase, what I would emphasize, especially during these times where the integrity of our assessment is somehow challenged because the students could just copy and paste everything from Google. So you should think of an assessment where the students, if they will cheat, it won't really matter if they will cheat. What I'm trying to say is, kana bitang given naman yun na ng estudyante maning kamot yun na sila makakuha good nga score balagwa sila kasabot so mag-cheat yun na sila with their classmates. So mangita kag assessment dapat or activity na bahala pag mag-cheat sila wala siya bearing ba kanang pwede gyud sila mag-cheat pero kanang dili gyapon sila makakuha og good na score kung mag-cheat sila. For example, ingon ani, as I was saying, what I'm doing in my physics classes is I give unique problems for each group. That means to say na somehow I am thinking na in my evaluation, mag-cheat man yun mga estudyante. Ilabi nag-problem solving, isa lang na ilang pasulbaron, kopyahon din ang satanan. So what I am thinking, I am giving problem for each group. And then instead of, you know, capitalizing, I am capitalizing of the fact that they will cheat. So I give problems, siguro 2 problems per group, and I said, discuss this problem within your group, and then you submit. Each of you will submit an individual solution for me. So basically, the point there is you're allowing the student to collaborate with the group mates. So dili na sila maghunahuna nag-cheat ra ba ko, or dili na sila maghunahuna mag-cheat pa sila kay you give them an opportunity to collaborate man in the first place. And also the point of allowing them to submit individual nga solution even though they deal with the same problem in a group, it is because of the fact that we don't want the student to simply copy and paste from their classmates. So makita na to dapat ang originality in how they present their solution. And that is one thing that you should emphasize that you are going to check sa imong estudyante. But that is just one suggestion. There are a lot of suggestions which you could actually do. Yeah, you just need to be mindful of the integrity of your assessments such that you are actually measuring. That means the score that will be given from the assessments that you are conducting is really a reflective of the level of the understanding of your students. The last part is the extend phase. In the extend phase, this is somehow related to elaborate phase. So this is usually where you give the assignments, for example, and the assignments could be something. If I'm handling the class, the assignment I usually give is not something to prepare them for the next lesson, but it's something as a follow-up of the lesson that we did for that day. Because for me, that is the purpose of extend. Whenever the first 6 phases are insufficient to say to perfectly mold them, not perfectly, but to ideally mold them to understand the concept, then extend is there for us to provide another opportunity to better the understanding of the students. And usually it is also, if in the elaborate we put it in a new context, that is also the same thing that we are doing in extend. Katong mga learning na ilahang supposed to be na-gain sa atong mga estudyante, we try to put it in a new context, in an extend, and allow the students to exercise again the transfer of learning dito sa new context. And I know I am speaking of new context in both elaborate and extend, but in extend, the new context is somehow farther from the discussion na. But it doesn't mean that the new context is very far from the discussion, that the concept that they are learning is no longer applicable. No, you need to think of a context that is somehow far from the discussion that you are doing, but you are trying to test whether that student could actually put that new context in a somewhat different or in a further context kung masabtan ba gyud gihapon niya unsay implication sa concept nga ilang na learn sa klase. It's up to your creativity to think of activities to fit the extend na part. Why extend is really iterated. You might ask, sir, why is there still an extend? Na naman tayo elaborate. Diba ang elaborate is about transferring to a new context magyapon. And then extend is also transferring na pud to another context but somehow farther from the concept that you are teaching. But not totally unrelated. Mao na tong klarohon, no? Nganong naman na siya because we are really emphasizing the transfer of learning by Thorndike here. Na dapat gyud ang learning nato sa estudyante are not really confined in the classroom nga masabtan sa estudyante. Yes, nasabtan nila ang concept pero ana lang na context. What if there will be a new context? Will the student be able to transfer that learning to this new context? That is why instead of having elaborate alone, we really need to follow up with how the transfer of learning is going on through the extend phase.